Hello, welcome back to Supposedly Fun. I am Greg. So, roughly every year there is a literary phenomenon that gets published and everybody has to read it. It doesn't even really feel like an option, it's something that you have to read. That book inevitably gets discussed in a lot of different places by a lot of different people, so it feels like it's just everywhere you look. And this year I am not talking about The Testaments by Margaret Atwood, I'm talking about The Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. This is the first book to be released after Colson Whitehead won a Pulitzer Prize for The Underground Railroad. It has been anticipated, it has been reviewed a lot, so I feel like I'm in a bit of a tricky situation here because it's been discussed so much. I don't know that there's a whole lot that I can add to the conversation about it. There's not much that I can say that has not already been said. If you are unaware, first of all, who are you? Where are you? But if you're not aware, The Nickel Boys follows two boys, Elwood Curtis and Turner. Elwood is a good boy living in the Jim Crow era in the South. He follows the teachings of Martin Luther King. He is getting ready to go to college, but one mistake sends him to the Nickel Academy, which is supposed to be a reformatory for juvenile delinquents, but in actuality is pretty much a chamber of horrors. It is a place where the staff is sadistic. There's sexual abuse, corruption, you name it, it exists, and there's a graveyard around back for the boys who particularly displease the people who run the place. Making things even worse, it is based on a real place, the Dozier School in Florida. So that's the plot. If you haven't read this book, I really encourage you to read it. It's very good. But I also feel like a lot of people have already talked about why it's good and why it's important. Like Brian over at Bookish had a great review. Matthew Sharapa had a great review. There are a lot of other reviews out there. So when I was trying to think, what can I add to this conversation, I figured a reading list for things to read once you have finished The Nickel Boys, or if you're interested in The Nickel Boys. Just give you an idea of where you can go next. Now, the obvious answer to this question is to read more Colson Whitehead. And the good thing about Colson Whitehead is that his books are very different. Some of his books lean a little further into satire, some of his books are a little more dramatic, and there's even a zombie novel. Yeah, that's a thing that exists. I recommend you stay away from that one, though. I did not like it. But he was also a Pulitzer Prize finalist for John Henry Days, which is a book that's on my TBR. The Intuitionist is supposed to be good. Sag Harbor is supposed to be good. The one I'm actually most interested in reading is Apex Hides the Hurt, which is one of his more satirical novels about advertising and marketing. Sounds really interesting. But so yeah, if you like The Nickel Boys, maybe explore more Colson Whitehead. Another thing you can do is check out articles about the Dozier School. You can learn more about the actual history, which is what inspired Colson Whitehead to write this book in the first place. NPR in particular has a great article that was written about the school in 2012. I will link that in the description box down below. There are a lot of other articles out there. Definitely seek them out. Find out more about what specifically is being written about in The Nickel Boys. Or you could go with the book that I'm following up The Nickel Boys with, which is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm listening to this on audio. It's only about a 3.5 hour audiobook, so really it should be really easy to get through. I'm about a half hour in. It's really good so far. Basically, Between the World and Me is about the author's complex relationship to his country and his life growing up as a black man in America. It is really fascinating. And as an added bonus, Ta-Nehisi Coates reads the audiobook. So if you're inclined toward audiobooks, it's a good way to go. Now, one thing that can happen when people are recommending books is that they recommend something that is a very similar experience to what you already read, and that isn't always good, but it also isn't always bad. So, The Nickel Boys is a very unflinching book that does not shy away from the violence at its heart, does not shy away from making the reader uncomfortable when the reader should be uncomfortable because what's happening is horrible. So, a book that's kind of in a similar vein, maybe one you might not want to read right after finishing The Nickel Boys, but one you should think about in the future, is Ruby by Cynthia Bond. This book gets a bad rap in online reviews because it's quote-unquote depressing. Well, I mean, the sad fact is, life of the people who are being portrayed in this book, namely black Americans in the 1950s, I believe, was not so great. This book really delves into the horrors of lynching and the psychological toll of systemic racism. It is a great book. It is a difficult book, but in a way that is important to experience and to deal with, because that's really what we should do. If you want to go with unflinching books, I would also say you could read anything by Toni Morrison. I mean, anything. Pick one of her books. The Beloved is probably her most famous book. It is the one that won her a Pulitzer Prize. It is going to be part of my Pulitzer Prize project. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I think I'm going to absolutely love it. I just finished The Bluest Eye, which was actually her debut novel, and it's kind of astonishing that this was her first book because it is so, like, basically she just started writing novels as a fully formed writer. It's amazing what she did, what she was able to accomplish. But there's also Jazz, The Song of Solomon, Sula, Love. Pick one of her books and go with it. It's bound to be amazing. Next, because I mentioned that Colson Whitehead kind of leans into satire sometimes, let's talk about some books that are a little bit more satirical. The first is Welcome to Braggsville by T. Geronimo Jones. This is something that is on my TBR. It follows three friends who want to stop a Civil War reenactment, which has recently been rebranded Patriot Day. From there, it wrestles with the weight of history and representation from the perspective of modern characters who understand social media and who exist in the age of Barack Obama. It's supposed to be a good book. Or you could go with The Good Lord Bird by James McBride. God, this is a good book. So this follows a young slave boy named Henry Shackelford who survives a raid by dressing as a girl. From there, he gets tangled in John Brown's abolitionist movement, where he has to continue to pretend to be a girl in order to stay out of fighting. As a girl, he is called Onion. This book covers a lot of ground thematically, but most poignantly of all, it hints at how being a slave robs you of your identity so thoroughly that you're unable to figure out who you are. It's a really good book. I absolutely recommend this. Or you could go with Booker Prize winning The Sellout by Paul Beatty. I can't believe I haven't gotten around to reading this book yet. This is a story about a black man who gets in front of the Supreme Court in order to reinstate slavery. Yeah. I have not heard a bad review of this book. I don't know anybody who has read this and disliked it. So I'm really looking forward to getting to it at some point. Next, let's get into some books that are kind of either ripped from the headlines or based in some element of truth, kind of like the Nickel Boys. And the first one is Joyce Carol Oates' Black Water. This is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a very slim volume. So basically, this is a fictionalized version of the last moments of Mary Jo Kopechne. Who is Mary Jo Kopechne? She is the girl who drowned in the car of Senator Ted Kennedy when he drove into the water leaving a party. And instead of calling for help, he called his lawyer. Despite being a slim book, this book packs a very powerful punch. I would absolutely recommend this. If you're into Joyce Carol Oates, you could also go with another Pulitzer Prize finalist that she wrote, which is Blonde. Eric Carl Anderson talked about this recently because it is a large book, and it really revived my interest in getting around to reading this at some point. Basically, this is the story of Norma Jean Baker, who, of course, is more famously known as Marilyn Monroe, and her life could not get much more different in terms of size, but I think either one has that element of truth in novel form that the Nickel Boys does have. You could also go with Women Talking by Miriam Taves. Now, this, also inspired by true events, is about women in a Mennonite village who meet in secret to decide if they are going to stay within their community or leave forever after discovering that they have been being drugged and sexually assaulted in their sleep. This book, which is surprisingly funny, by the way, asks really profound questions about faith, revenge/forgiveness, and gender roles. It's really good. Miriam Taves is an author that if you have not read, you should get around to reading at some point. And up next, there is You Will Be Safe Here by Damien Barr. This is about the legacies of abuse in South Africa. In one timeline, a mother and her young son are forced from their home and relocated to a concentration camp where they are promised that they will be safe. In the other timeline, which is set in 2014, a young boy is forced into a training camp this promises to turn boys into men, and he is promised that he will be safe there. It's supposed to be unflinching, very good. I've also followed Damien Barr on Twitter. Seems like a really great author, very smart man. Can't wait to get around to reading this. Then we can talk about some books that deal with the legacies of either slavery or racism, or both. The first one being Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi. This novel starts with two half-sisters in Africa. One of them is captured and sent to America on a boat in chains. The other one remains behind. Every chapter jumps one generation ahead, alternating between Africa and the United States, to tell the story of what happens to their children and their children's children and their children's children's children. In doing so, Homegoing exposes the lasting legacy of the slave trade on both continents. I have heard it criticized because essentially it follows short stories, and people say because it keeps jumping ahead you don't get to latch onto any characters, but that's kind of the point of the book to me, and I really enjoyed it. There's also The Turner House by Angela Flournoy. This book ostensibly aims a lot smaller than a lot of the other books on this list, but I think it's no less profound. So basically it follows the Turner family. When their mother is in poor health, the Turner children must come together to figure out how to care for her and what to do with their old family home. And this book is set at the peak of the financial crisis, and at this point in time, their old family home is only worth about a tenth of its mortgage. So basically, the home is a burden that they can't get rid of. In telling the story of the family, the Turner House also tells the story of the city where they live, which is Detroit, and its relationship to race and its complex relationship to the people who live there, who kind of maintain the factories and do a lot of the work that makes the city go. It is a staggering novel for a debut. I would absolutely recommend it. And then there's a book from my Pulitzer Prize project. This is The Keepers of the House by Shirley Ann Grau. This won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 1965, and it exposes the legacy of slavery and racism in the South by telling the story of the Howland family, who have been living on the same land since the early 1800s, and it exposes secrets that have been kept about their relationship with their slaves, and then after the Civil War, their relationship with their servants. It's supposed to be a very good book. Can't wait to get around to that as well. Then there are some books that are just really great stories. And yes, I recommend Half-Blood Blues by S.E. Adujan a lot. My channel, I can do what I want. But yeah, I love this book. So my elevator pitch for this is that it's Amadeus crossed with Cabaret with a dash of atonement. And really, what more do you need? Then there's a classic book, which is Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. This is another book that is on my TBR. It's a story of a man who's invisible not because of science fiction reasons, but because of the color of his skin and because society basically refuses to see him. It's supposed to be really good. I've heard a lot of great things about this book from people whose opinion on books I really respect. Now there's a book that's also kind of controversial because I've heard some people who don't like it. I happen to love it. It's Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. Basically, this is a deeply narrative work, and I think that's where it loses some people. It's written as if the main character is telling you a story, and she occasionally goes into digressions, and there's a very slow burn to this, which I found profound, but some people think is kind of interminable. I love it. Basically, it follows students at a mysterious boarding school called Hailsham, who they are, why they are so restricted in what they can and cannot do, and what their ultimate purpose in life is something that is slowly teased out and revealed through the course of the book. I think it is absolutely devastating. I love it, and I would absolutely recommend it to you. Then you can go with really either novel by Jesmyn Ward, Salvage the Bones, or Sing Unburied Sing. I'm going to call it right now. It is only a matter of time before Jesmyn Ward wins a Pulitzer Prize for Fiction and takes her place beside Colson Whitehead in the modern literary world. She's that good. I think she deserves it. Both of these books are phenomenal. And of course, you couldn't really go wrong with The Handmaid's Tale if you want to read it for the first time or if you want to prepare yourself for the sequel. It's your life. I am not excited about the sequel. I don't think this book needs a sequel, but I do love this book. Then there are some nonfiction books. All of these are on my TBR. I have not read them, but they sound fascinating. The first is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. This is about the mass incarceration of black people, especially black men, since the civil rights struggle, and how incarceration has in many ways come to replace segregation as a way of keeping black men down. She discusses how if you have a felony conviction, you can't vote, so incarceration can also lead to voter suppression. There's also The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. You really can't go wrong with James Baldwin, and this classic book about racial injustice is one of his most famous books. There's Ain't I a Woman by Bell Hooks, which not only deals with the experience of being a black person in this country, but deals with the experience of being a black woman who is a feminist and trying to find a place within the feminist movement, which I think is a very important story to hear. Or there's Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. This approaches racism from a psychological perspective and shows how entrenched our feelings about race can be in ways that we might not even recognize. Or there's National Book Award winner Stand From the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. This is a look at the incredible pervasiveness of racism in American history and how it has been here from the very beginning. I've heard great things about this book as well. Or you can go back to Jesmyn Ward and read the book Men We Reaped. It was written in the wake of Jesmyn Ward losing 5 men who were important to her, including her brother, within 5 years, and her search for an answer to the question, why? So there you go, there's a bunch of books that you can read if you have read The Nickel Boys or if you're interested in reading The Nickel Boys. I would also recommend a podcast called Revisionist History, which comes from Malcolm Gladwell. A lot of the episodes deal with the topic of race in America. The mission statement of the podcast is to examine things that have either been forgotten or popularly misunderstood. It is a fascinating podcast and I think would be true to the spirit of The Nickel Boys. So there you go, those are my recommendations. If you have other recommendations, or if you think some of these recommendations are off the mark and people should steer clear of them, leave those comments down below. I would love to hear them. And I'll be back again. I always appreciate your time. Thank you for watching this. And until next time, happy reading.